Professional mountain biker Adam Craig says it's one of the top 3 places in the universe he's ridden. Where is this magical mountain biking nirvana? It's none other than Brevard, North Carolina, home to Pisgah National Forest and DuPont Recreational Forest. The area boasts over 300 miles of peerless single track, not to mention hundreds of miles of gravel roads, creating a near endless array of routes, terrains, and challenges to explore. 4 vibrant bike shops will get you sorted, whether you need gear, service, or a top-notch rental. Top it off with an array of craft breweries, cafes, and gathering spots that have earned Brevard the title as one of the best small towns in America in 2021. It all adds up to a premier mountain biking destination you'll want to experience for yourself. Find out more at explorebrevard.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Singletracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today Matt and Gerow and I are going to be talking about mountain bike trends. And, it's the start of a new year. And so for this show, we're going to start by talking about some recent trends, some trends from 2021 and maybe a few years before that. And then we'll move into what we think we're going to see more of or less of this year. And so I'm really excited. This should be a fun conversation for sure. For those who don't know, Gerow is our tech editor, so he's our expert on gear and doing product reviews and that sort of thing. And Matt is our features editor, and so he's always tracking things like trails, advocacy, community issues, racing, and things like that. So we should have a good mix of different trends to talk about. So, Gerow, I'm going to start with you and ask about a recent trend in 2021 that we covered a good bit on the site, and that is mixed wheel bikes. What's the deal with mixed wheel bikes?
What's the deal with mixed wheels? So I've actually only had a chance to try out one mixed wheel bike, but we've definitely seen a lot come across the desk in terms of news and new bikes, and it seems like every brand kind of wants to have one available. Some companies are putting in different links so that they can just change their 29er to a mixed wheel bike and kind of have the same geometry. And from everything I understand from talking with athletes, the main advantage is for people with short inseams. So they're not like if you're racing gravity in particular, so you have a little more clearance between your butt and the tire when it's super steep. And other than that, several athletes that I've talked with have said like it's not faster. It's not a ton more maneuverable, but if I've got a little more clearance and I can kind of like throw down with a little more confidence because of that, then it just works out better. So
yeah. Why is this like a new thing? Like, I mean, I guess we've always had the ability to do that. Why do you think it's like gaining popularity sort of all of a sudden? Or maybe it's not all of a sudden. I mean, people have been doing it for years, but it does seem like we're seeing it a lot more. You have any thoughts on that, Gerow?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's maybe gained a little more light in the mainstream as like one, this is skeptical, but it's a way to sell bikes. It's something new. People can get excited about it and think like, hey, I want to try that. If it works well for folks like Martin Mays and Isabu Cordiere, like maybe I should do that too. So I think that's always part of it. And then, just seeing folks who are really fast who it works well for. I think there's always the question of if that works for the fastest people in the world, maybe I should try it. So I think that's part of it too. Yeah,
definitely. What about you, Matt? Have you had a chance to test any mixed wheel bikes? Or I know you've definitely covered it in a trend piece in 2021. What are your thoughts on mixed wheels?
No, I mean, I haven't ridden any actually. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like more and more bigger brands are kind of moving their 27-inch platforms to a mixed wheel platform. I thought like the best example of that, I guess that was this past year, was when Santa Cruz moved their Bronson to a mixed wheel. And like, I had talked to them years ago, probably at least like 2 or 3 years ago, about 27 and then 29. And they're like, oh yeah, like we're going to have 27 is going to be a dedicated platform for us for a while. And, we'll offer basically both wheel sizes, and then alluded to, one of their best selling bikes being 27.5, which assuming at that time was the Bronson. And then this year, now it got 50% bigger in the wheel size. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I think like Gerow had mentioned, maybe it keeps it a little bit more maneuverable, but then you get the front end rollover confidence as well. So yeah. And again, like you mentioned, it's another reason to make some of your bikes that are maybe not going to progress in other areas like geometry or suspension kinematics a little bit more exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you raised an interesting point too. You kind of alluded to the fact that 27.5 as a wheel size, I mean, it seems to be, the popularity of it is decreasing. We're seeing fewer of those types of bikes, and maybe doing mixed wheels, mulleting bikes is a way to kind of bridge that gap, like to take those 27.5 bikes and get some of the advantages of 29ers, but then maybe still address the things that people like about 27.5 bikes. I know one of the bikes I tested in 2021, the Thompson Hooch, was originally designed as a 27.5 hardtail. And, you know, to very few people's surprise, like that bike didn't sell that well because nobody wants a 27.5 hardtail right now. I'm sure there are dedicated riders, but that's not sort of the popular thing. And so they use that as an opportunity to pivot that bike and to say, well, you know, if you put a bigger wheel on the front, then it becomes a different bike, and it kind of, you know, gets you closer to a 29er, but, you know, still not a full blown 29er. So yeah, maybe best of both worlds, and just an easy way to swap too. I mean, I think people are always looking for affordable ways to like upgrade or, you know, freshen up their bikes, and mixed wheel seems to be that also.
Yeah, I think one other piece of the story here is for race teams. Just to back it up to my comment earlier, I kind of forgot to mention this, that if you're a team manager and a mechanic, having those mixed wheel sizes, especially in enduro where folks have to run the same wheels, like if any of the spokes break, you've got to have that many more spoke lengths.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And if somebody flats a tire, you've got to have more tires. You can't just like grab whatever 29er tire you've got. Mm-hmm. And then same thing with rims. So I'm sure it is adding a little bit to the massive pile of stuff that those teams have to haul around.
Yeah, right.
That's a good point.
It's a big disadvantage for sure. And so, yeah, it's almost like the advantages must be like really big if people are willing to put up with that in the race situation. Even me personally, when I've had mixed wheel bikes in for test, I'm like, do I have to carry like multiple tubes? No, you don't, but you can make either one fit in either wheel size, but it's not ideal. And same with the tires. You know, if you pinch a tire, better hope you got a backup in the right size back in the garage. So
for sure.
Yeah, I'd say like the other interesting thing too is like as more brands sort of deliver it as an option from the factory, like the messaging behind them has always been that they're not, you know, you shouldn't take your 27 bike and make it a mullet, and you shouldn't take your 29-inch bike and make it a mullet because it's going to whack the geometry. You're going to void the warranty, and it's just not made for that. And I think a lot of people have tried that, and maybe it's worked, and maybe the brands have been right. But yeah, then again, it is just to sort of hop on this train of attacking the brands like we all love to do for selling them stuff that we may not need. But, you know, now that you can sort of deliver that package this wheel set is designed around this geometry, mm-hmm. which, to give credit to Mullet Cycles, is what they've been doing for a long time. But yeah, now you again have sort of like this new model that's designed around that mixed wheel set, and is going to come straight from the factory, and you don't have to argue about warranties with them if something goes wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, is it them sort of acquiescing to the consumer demands in offering that, or what is behind it? That's really interesting, because a lot of the bikes, it can be hard to tell, but when brands are offering like a 29er or like a matched wheel build of a bike and also a mixed wheel version, you look at those frame details and geometry, and it's pretty clear they're using the same frame. I mean, they're doing what most consumers would do at home. They just put a different wheel, hopefully a different fork, and, you know, maybe they adjust the travel on the fork a bit. But yeah, for the most part, they're like actually, it's fine.
Usually they throw a different link in there to make change the bottom bracket height.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another cool thing that some brands are doing is offering, like I think of the V10, for example, offering the same bike where you can set it up with whatever wheel configuration you want. You could go both 27.5, both 29, or mixed. And that's pretty sweet. Like, especially if you're racing and it happens to work better on a certain track and you happen to have all those wheel options with you. That could be pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's flip over to the trail side and talk about the trend of mountain bike trails, like good mountain bike trails, purpose-built mountain bike trails, popping up in unlikely places and pretty much everywhere on the planet. You know, I think the example that comes to mind that most people are familiar with is Bentonville, Arkansas, where they've built a lot of trails where traditionally there hadn't been much of a mountain bike scene, but we're also seeing it in other places as well. Matt, what are some of the stories that we've covered over the last couple of years along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think Arkansas has sort of served as like this model and like economic viability study to say, for basically any town to say, hey, we can do this too and like turn around our economy. And there's a lot of older examples of that too, you know, up in Sierra Nevada, or say Copper Harbor, or I mean, all over the place. But yeah, now places like, you know, smaller cities in the South, I think it was Ironton, Missouri that we covered last year. Yeah. I mean, mountain biking in Missouri, Ely, Nevada is a small destination that's sort of building more trails. Cedar City in Utah, which is an hour and a half north of St. George. So yeah, I mean, just like all these places that people wouldn't have normally thought of for mountain biking, as long as you've got an internet and kind of see what other towns have done with their trails, and you've got, well, a boom and bust cycle especially, and can say, hey, we can build sustainable recreation here, then yeah, I mean, I think we'll just continue to see more and more of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that strikes me and that makes me think that there's something new and different going on here is that a lot of these trail projects, again, like spread all over the place, they're calling themselves mountain bike parks. And, you know, I used to associate that with like ski resorts or, you know, like a real, you know, dedicated place to ride. And these are dedicated places to ride, but they're popping up on, you know, municipally owned properties. Counties and cities are building these trails. One of the places I know that you wrote a bit about last year, Matt, San Lee Park in Sanford, North Carolina. I mean, this is like Eastern Carolina where there's very little elevation. Lee and I used to ride at San Lee, and it was, you know, old hiking trail type of experience there. Definitely was not geared toward mountain biking specifically, but, you know, they've put in a lot of work over the years and have really transformed it with jump lines and big features and things that, yeah, you wouldn't have seen that even just a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mountain bike population as a whole, I mean, they're just much hungrier than any other user group for those types of trails. Like hikers aren't going to treat a destination the same way. Like they're not going to drive 2 hours to go and hike in like the rolling hills of somewhere just because they built new hiking trails. To whereas like, yeah, mountain biking is much more about that experience on the trail. I feel like hiking gravitates more toward, you know, these scenic vistas and sort of like these summits, and mountain bikers really just want fun trails to ride in the end. Like when it comes down to it, like it could matter less whether there are amazing views and things like that. As long as we have fun trails to ride, then yeah, you can make a lot more money.
Yeah. It's funny too. This is also one of those though that I'm kind of on the fence. I'm kind of like, is this a trend? Is this something we should retire? Like the trope, like, oh, I was pleasantly surprised by the trails in XYZ location. And it's like, should we be surprised anymore that there are good trails pretty much anywhere? I mean, if people want to build them, then they're going to build them, and you can make really great trails no matter where you are.
And then another kind of funny element to the difference between the way hikers and mountain bikers interact with trails is I don't know of anybody who hikes regularly, and several of my friends do, who goes out and builds trails like on their own time or even maintains them. Like they hike, they enjoy the trails, but I know a whole lot of mountain bikers who like every other weekend are out digging trail and cleaning trail and doing it on their own and with trail organizations and all of the above. I think that's a distinction, at least for a lot of hikers and mountain bikers as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's like we create our own fun in a lot of ways. I mean, the hikers, there's going to be hiking trails. People love to hike to like a waterfall or like a scenic vista. And like, you can't build more waterfalls. You can't build more scenic overlooks. I mean, I guess you cut down a bunch of trees, put in a deck. But, I mean, for us, we can create it. We can just take a piece of dirt and like make it fun, make it worth visiting. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned, being surprised by those destinations. And I'd met some folks at a party a couple months ago who were like, oh my gosh, and this just came up with somebody else like yesterday, actually, with some of my wife's friends, but oh my gosh, have you been to Arkansas? Like there's all these mountain bike trails and this and that. And, if you're a mountain biker, you're already tuned into that conversation, but kind of contrasting it with ski destinations to where you look at like the enormous cost of living in ski destinations. And you can't when was the last time a new ski destination or ski mountain in the US popped up? Like tens of years, because you can't just build new ski destinations. The mountains that kind of get that snow that make it worth to build an actual ski resort, like those are pretty much taken up.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas there's still so much real estate for mountain biking, it's just, a lot easier to create a trail destination.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, and similar to those ski destinations, I mean, the trails in Arkansas were funded by one group of folks who has a ton of money. Like that's not going to happen everywhere. It's not like every state can look to Arkansas and be like, oh, we'll just do what they did as long as we find the right benefactor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things.
Maybe Amazon.
Yeah, Bezos. He would build an indoor one, right? He's got those like biodome things at their headquarters. It's like a bunch of trees and plants like living inside. Pretty weird.
Jump to the moon.
Anyway,
there you go.
Yeah. But yeah, I was going to say we'll definitely talk more about this in the next part of the episode where we talk about the upcoming trends. Because I think trail funding is definitely something that has been changing pretty recently, even more so than seeing these destinations pop up in surprising places. So before we get into the upcoming trends, let's keep talking about some of the stuff that's already trending. And the next one I have on the list is high pivot bikes. And Matt, you wrote a piece, you tested a high pivot bike in 2021 and then wrote about sort of your experience, what you found from riding one. What's the deal with high pivot bikes? Why is this a trend? And do you think this is like something that we're going to see grow even more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will continue to grow, but Gerow, definitely jump in if I explain this wrong. But yeah, I mean, the high pivot sort of, and like combining it with other existing suspension designs like the horse link, to where it had been usually reserved for single pivot bikes, but moving that pivot up and combining it with something that gets a lot of, or something that has a lot of anti-squat built into it. So like an enduro bike where you want this really progressive platform that's going to climb really well. You throw that high pivot on and the idler pulley, then you also have something that's, usually as you raise anti-squat, then you decrease small bump sensitivity. And so, I mean, keeping that, adding the high pivots, and then you've got something that's still, and then you factor in all this chain growth, right? So you have long travel bike, suspension compresses, you've got a ton of chain growth. So the high pivot sort of eliminates that, keeps small bump sensitivity. And, again, sort of this best of both worlds situation, and often used trope describing mountain bike technology. But
yes.
Yeah. Anything I missed in there, Gerow?
No, I think that's great. Yeah. And I think your article explains that stuff really well too. Like lines up with my experience with high pivot bikes as well. I've only ridden two, but I think the rear axle path is really cool. Like you can kind of notice a bit of a difference, but an engineer friend brought up to me that, the axle has to go forward as well when it goes back down. So, it would be really intriguing to see some actual like data and research around that. Like, does that have a negative effect, or do you need to set up the suspension differently so that so that it doesn't have a negative effect, or as much as, mitigate that as much as possible. Yeah, I'm really curious to see if this trend of high pivot bikes, particularly on like shorter travel trail and enduro bikes, continues, because it is more complicated, it weighs more, and the other systems are also winning races and doing super well. So, even Commensal, who like they've tested all versions of suspension essentially, and now they're on to a 6 bar with their downhill bike. Yeti's moved to a 6 bar, and that is added stuff, added moving parts, more things to break, more places for dirt to get caught as well. But it's not the idler pulley, and I think the idler pulley kind of is a turnoff for a lot of folks. So it'd be interesting to see how that endures, especially for the handful of bikes that just recently came out and probably need to keep their carbon molds for a little while.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a little polarizing still, because it's funny. The first time I rode it around a switchback, and there's some hikers sitting there, and one of them was like, "Oh my gosh, look at that gearing!" And I was like, "What are they talking about?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, a high pivot looks completely foreign to anything else." But I also feel like, in the beginning, where maybe it was just forbidden, and who else using this high pivot platform on Deviate, it might have seemed a little bit novel. And I feel like as more and more brands like Cannondale, GT, Norco start using it, it sort of has like this corroboration and validation effect to where it's easier for brands to kind of go in on it and sell it to consumers, because consumers are less skeptical of the idea. I think that's why I think it would grow.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, those are good technical explanations for high pivot. And to be honest, my eyes kind of glaze over when we start talking about anti-squat and progression curves and all that stuff. It's kind of over my head, but I'm really curious to know, is this something, since both of you have ridden high pivot bikes, is this something A, that you can really feel and that you're like, yes, this is doing something different? And B, is it so much better for certain type of riding that you would prefer it, that you would say, yeah, I want a high pivot bike, like my next bike's going to be high pivot? Any thoughts on that, Gerow?
So I would say for A, does it really feel different? For me, so I've ridden the Jekyll and then the Deviate Highlander. And on the Jekyll, it didn't feel super special. Like, it kind of felt like I was riding not any long travel trail bike, but like definitely didn't feel like amazing. I wasn't like, holy cow, this is super different and special and whatever. And granted, I only did a few runs on that, so maybe with a better suspension setup, it really would feel different. And then on the Highlander, it was like I was blown away. It was 140 millimeters of travel that felt like way more. And I almost never say that because I find that phrase annoying, but
it felt like 240.
I was just like, there's no way this is a 140 millimeter bike. This thing just plows through everything and feels amazing. I really enjoyed that bike. So I think it depends on how it's used.
Yeah, so it's just like a factor. It's not the factor where you're like, oh, instantly throw my leg over a high pivot. I'm like, woo, this is different.
Totally, yeah. And from my experience, and Matt, I'm sure you can speak to this as well, like, I don't have the sense that it depends on the rider too. Like, it's a bike that's going to go fast most of the time, and that's kind of what the platform, where it shines. But if you like to play a lot and jump and bounce around, like, I just don't feel like a high pivot is going to be your bike, really. Like, it's kind of a go fast and ram through everything kind of a situation, which for me, I would say I would buy a high pivot bike because that's how I like to ride. And then I also might not buy one because there's a lot simpler systems that I can also do that with. So yeah, it's a toss up.
Interesting. Yeah. What do you think, Matt? Is high pivot for you? Is it going to be your next bike, or is it not as important?
Yeah. It wouldn't be the sole factor for me. Like when I read the GT, I thought they did a really good job of tuning in support to where it still felt quite poppy going off of jumps and, routes and those kinds of things. Where I thought it made the biggest difference is off of drops and kind of high speed, like chunky trails. Also, just a lot less noise. Like because you're sort of like controlling the chain growth. And then, I mean, there is definitely a factor, like if the bike feels a lot more composed in those like really high speed, chunky situations, but less noisy. It feels a little bit more composed. So I felt like the riding characteristics were there, but then again, there'd be so many other factors like the geometry, the look of the bike, suspension design that would still go into the cost, that would go into, whether I bought the bike or not, not just because it's a high pivot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is like everything in mountain biking, there's like pros and there's cons, and, everybody's going to come down a little bit differently on like which factors are more important to them. And so, I mean, that's why this is a fun discussion. Why, just writing about this and testing new things is fun too, because you get to have these conversations and really understand stuff. It's never black and white where it's just like high pivot. That's the thing. It's a new discovery where every bike's going to have this from now on. Yeah. It just never happens that way. So, Gerow, you kind of touched on this just now, mentioning the 6-bar suspension platforms designs that we're starting to see. And this may be sort of an emerging trend if we really think about it. It's just been pretty recently we've seen this, and we're hearing that there's potentially going to be more bikes using that design. But it got me thinking about weight and complexity. And it seems like over the past several seasons, mountain bikers have kind of given up on trying to like cut a ton of weight off their bikes. Matt, it's been a couple of years, I think, since you wrote an opinion piece about, weight not being that important when it comes to mountain bikes. And one of the trends that's like followed along with that is aluminum frames becoming popular again in place of carbon, because obviously they cost less, and at the same time they tend to be a little heavier. So what do you think about that, Matt? Is this an ongoing trend in terms of like people not worrying about weight on their bikes, or is this one kind of done?
I mean, I feel like as things have, you've got more aluminum bikes, or at least like they seem like they're coming back because they're making the sport a little bit more accessible, or keeping it a little bit more affordable for people. I think my point with that article was that it matters less than it used to, because the suspension kinematics and the geometry have gotten so much better over the years that you don't feel weight like you used to with really crappy, stinky suspension where you're like blowing through your travel trying to get up a hill. Yeah, I mean, it's like case in point, I've talked about it a bunch, that Ibis Ripley AF, which was like a 32.5 pound, 120 mil XC trail bike. And I mean, it's one of the best climbing bikes I rode last year.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. We were talking before the show, trying to think of examples of aluminum bikes. And unfortunately we didn't do our homework maybe necessarily on this, but it does feel like a lot of brands recently have like changed sort of how they roll out new bikes. Like for a while there, they were rolling out, they would do like a carbon version first and then like go back later and build the aluminum. But I feel like recently we saw some brands launch with the aluminum first. And unfortunately, I don't think we have any specific examples there, but it does seem like maybe things have shifted a little bit back in aluminum's favor. And one of the factors too is actually just looking at the materials and like sourcing and everything, where, aluminum is a recyclable material, whereas carbon fiber is not currently recyclable. And so that potentially plays into people's decisions as well. Drew, you have any thoughts on aluminum frames? Is that trending, or is that kind of stuck where it's always been?
I hope it's trending. The Trek Session came out, I think it was this year. It was this year. There was a new one, and that one came out aluminum first, and I believe it is aluminum only at the moment. Yeah, so that would be one example. I think one of the many cool things about aluminum as a frame material is that it doesn't require this like million plus, I don't know how much they cost, dollar carbon mold that is, that's a fixed thing. So aluminum kind of allows for...
Yeah. And it's made out of aluminum, I think, right? Are the molds made out of aluminum? It's like a giant block, I think. It's some metal.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't researched it too much, but I like the idea that if they want, engineers can make rolling changes with aluminum frames. So if they get to a point and they're like, oh, actually, this seat stay should be like 3 millimeters longer and everything would be better, they can just do that. I mean, I'm sure it's much more difficult than that. And like anyone who's a frame engineer heard me say that and like punch the wall. But but at least it's not like millions of dollars to make that change. I would imagine it's like a little more reasonable and they can shift things around and they don't have to like play model year games with their frame releases. So it just seems more flexible. And I mean, there's some aluminum bikes that are coming out that are not much heavier than carbon, if they're heavier at all. And when you look at wheels, like wheels have to be so overbuilt, or rims rather, if they're carbon, that they often are about the same weight. So, I mean, the advantages are growing slimmer, it seems.
Yeah, if you look how, Rocky Mountain has done their past few bikes, the Instinct and the Altitude, the upper link pieces on those are aluminum and they're bolted on to a carbon frame so that they can make, rolling frame updates and update the kinematics to that frame because they can more easily tailor aluminum.
Yeah, smart.
At least those pieces are aluminum. But I think Transition launched, I don't know if it was, I think the Spire might be aluminum only. And then the newer Patrol was aluminum first and then carbon, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and the Spire is also available in carbon now.
Okay. Yeah, and I just did the same thing with the Ripmo AF, where they launched the AF first. I had more aggressive geometry than the V1 Ripmo, and then the V2, I think, was the same geometry as the AF.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, you go back far enough, and that's how it was in the olden days. They would build a frame out of aluminum first, like work out kind of all the kinks, and then once they're set on that design, they would do the carbon. So it is unusual to be going back to that. We don't often in the bike industry kind of go backward, but yeah, it seems like people are rediscovering the advantages of working in aluminum. Cool. So, all right, the last one that I have on my list is electronics and digital everything. And obviously, I mean, the smartphone has transformed society and the world really over the past more than a decade. And the bike industry was bound to catch up and to join in on the fun. And so, yeah, this year, I guess it's been a couple years since SRAM introduced their wireless group, where you've got wireless drivetrain, wireless dropper post controls. We just are hearing today that SRAM bought Hammerhead, which makes GPS devices. And so, yeah, it seems like everything's going sort of digital. We're seeing more of that in bikes. Any other examples you can think of, Gerow, that come to mind?
I mean, just more and more e-bike integration, with the like control panels in the top tube and stuff like that, which is probably, I would imagine that's going to continue. That kind of gives brands more and more control over the look and the functionality of their bikes and seems to make sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Do you have any other ideas around that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Shimano at some point in the next year or two will probably release their competitor to Axis. What SRAM's at a GX Axis now. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't know. I kind of doubt they'll do like an NX Axis, right?
I don't know.
I don't know, but it is funny to think that Di2 is not a competitor.
Right. No, but and
it's not.
I'm thinking they will release a competitor to Axis. Yeah.
Yeah. Wireless version.
Yep. Yeah. Those wires are a pain in the butt.
Yeah. And we're even seeing the like Fox Live Valve, and then, RockShox has their version of the like computer controlled shocks. And we've got all kinds of meters and things we can put on our bikes to, figure out if we got the right tire pressure and, how we can adjust that and make sure our suspension settings are dialed. And, I was at the World Cup race last year in West Virginia, and it was distracting seeing bikes go by during the race, and there's like LED lights like flickering, like it's on people's derailleur, and like it's like is that even necessary? Like, who is anybody looking at that? Like, is that indicating to you, like, yes, your derailleur has battery power? Like, I don't even know. I almost think it's like to show off, and it's like blingy, and it's like, look, bikes are high tech. We have digital bikes now. But yeah, in a lot of cases, it is helping as well. There's a lot of new insights that we can gain from our riding and performance and things. Yeah, I suppose it's inevitable.
Yeah, I would say one last thing about the wireless shifting in particular and droppers. Like having lived in Bellingham for a little while now, long enough to have replaced 2 shift cables and housing, I really wouldn't mind having a wireless system. I'd kind of rather have to remember to charge battery every couple of weeks than have to deal with all of the mess and just deal with, like, you know, at least one ride before you remember to do that, where your shifting is just awful. So you don't have to do any of that when you don't have cables getting stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of advantages. And yeah, I mean, we've all gotten so used to all the like advantages and conveniences of having a smartphone. And so I think there's a lot of those that make sense for bikes, and it's improving them in a lot of ways for sure. Okay. So let's talk about some of the trends that we think we're going to see in 2022. We've hinted at it through these sort of older trends that we noticed from like last year. A lot of these are going to be continuing, obviously, into 2022. But what are some of the like emerging trends that maybe are just getting started? Well, one of the first ones on the list is longer dropper posts. People have wanted those for a while. And one of the solutions seems to be fatter seat posts. And Matt, you just did a piece about this. Tell us what's going on with these fatter 34.9 millimeter seat tubes.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, kind of like you've seen standards evolve everywhere else. And probably the best example of that this past year or two is the Fox 38 and the RockShox Zeb. You know, wider stanchion tubes to stabilize the bike or give a stiffer feel up front on longer travel enduro bikes. Yeah, I mean, one of the easiest things to do, like some of the people I talked to for this story mentioned, to make something stiffer is just to make the tube wider. And as geometry's progressed, the standover height's gotten lower, the seat tubes have gotten shorter, and more brands are speccing longer travel dropper posts on their bikes. So yeah, I mean, 7-8 years ago, well, Gerow, you and I ride mediums, like we would have been happy to get, 100 mil or 125 mil dropper posts on our bikes. And now it's like standard. Even anything less than 170 on a medium is, I think, going to be scoffed at soon. But as these like get longer, where most seat tubes have stayed 30.9 or 31.6, then they get flexier. The leverage puts more stress on the internals of the dropper post, and they could be more likely to, suffer reliability issues. So at least like some of the dropper post manufacturers I heard from seem to think that a lot more 34.9 seat tubes are coming down the line from bike manufacturers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any problem with this, Gerow? Is this like, I mean, most of us were tired of like new standards and things like that, but is this one like something to get all worked up about, or is it kind of no big deal?
I think this one seems fine. I mean, there's enough dropper post companies and frame companies that are saying like, hey, if people want longer droppers, this needs to happen. And I think Matt's research kind of shines a light on a lot of the reasons for that. Mm-hmm. I would say this feels a little bit like the mixed wheel discussion, where it's like, I think it matters more for people with longer inseams. Like, personally, I don't need more than 170 millimeter dropper. Like, I've ridden a bike with a 200 millimeter dropper, and I was just like, I don't notice any difference. The saddle's out of my way in the same way it was on the other bike. Yeah, so I think if you're shorter, it's kind of like, who cares? But not everybody is. And this will really suit people who are on extra large frames and want like a 200 plus millimeter dropper, and that's going to last just the same as everyone else's. So it's really cool for that.
Yeah, it seems like at least currently, the dropper post companies are more than willing to build their posts in a number of different diameters. I mean, they've even gone so far as to like go backwards and do the 27, was it 27.2 or whatever it is that like gravel bikes and maybe some road bikes traditionally run. I mean, it seems like they're going to be able to offer a number of diameters for a long time. And so this isn't a situation like with Boost where people are like, oh my gosh, like in a few years, am I even going to be able to buy like non-Boost wheels or that kind of thing? I think this seems like one where even if there is a transition, there's going to be plenty of time where you'll still be able to get parts for your older bike and everybody will be happy, hopefully.
Yeah, I think it's like other brands like, Specialized and Trek were early adopters of it. Dropper post manufacturers really had no choice to make a 34.9. So they got an early start. Otherwise it's like, they're not going to make dropper posts for every other bike except like two of the biggest brands in the world. So of course they're going to offer it. So yeah, I mean, I guess it would be an easier transition than, Boost and non-Boost and Boost 157 have all kind of happened to us.
Yeah, have happened to us. Yeah, it's a good way to put it. But at the same time too, yeah, there's like plenty of adapters and things that have come out in the years since. And so, yeah, I don't know if we were worried about it. Maybe we shouldn't have been as worried because, yeah, I mean, plenty of people are always going to have older bikes and there's going to be somebody out there finding solutions to making that work and making that transition as painless as possible. So let's get back to trails. So we talked about these trails popping up in sort of new, unexpected destinations. One of the things that I'm hearing is that trail funding is getting a little bit easier to come by. And I know locally here in Atlanta, it sounds like some of the like cities and county governments are actually kicking in funding for trail projects. In the old days, it would be, there would be like a mountain bike club and they would approach a government agency and say, hey, we want to build trails in this park. Our members, we're going to fundraise and we're going to like pay for them. All you got to do is like give us permission. And sometimes that was easy. A lot of times it was hard. But nowadays, I think, Matt, like you mentioned, tourism is kind of a proven thing and communities realize that these trail projects potentially are going to pay for themselves. What are you seeing with that, Matt, in terms of trail funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still going to be a lot of these like economic impact grants and things that are going to be up for grabs. Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of the demand is still going to come from mountain bike populations in towns that have governments that are not familiar with this idea. I think there's just still so many governments that are not familiar with the idea of investing in trails. And it takes mountain bike populations to kind of make them aware and say, hey, like, look what happened here. Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, it's sort of those smaller grants and I guess not necessarily small, but state or county level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the other part of that too, a lot of these places I'm thinking of, they're not doing it for tourism. They're doing it purely for recreation for the local citizens to enjoy. And perhaps one of the things that's changing is just the demographics of what mountain bikers look like. You're seeing a lot more kids and families getting involved and, NICA taking off in these high school mountain bike leagues where kids aren't playing baseball as much as they used to, perhaps. And so instead of investing in more fields, governments are saying, hey, like, let's build trails instead if that's what people want. And I mean, it's taken a lot of time for us to get to this point, to get mountain bikers into these positions of authority. Our sport is still relatively new. And so, it's taken some time for it to become, dare I say it, mainstream. But, it feels like something's changing. Any thoughts on that, Gerow? Have you noticed any of that being back in the US or in Italy as well? Was this a conversation people were having?
In Italy, for sure not. Really, it's just kind of like people opening old footpaths, and that's the majority of the trails. And then there are bike parks in ski resorts, but they've been there for a long time, so it's not really anything new. And then here, it seems like there's a decent amount of money that goes into some of the trails in Bellingham, but more than half of the trails are off the map, and they're built by local folks who have been building the trails since before there was a trail association. So those are free.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a mix, but my understanding, at least from talking to locals, is that the trails that are built off the map there's just as many of them, if not more, as there are on the map, and they're really good. I mean, I've ridden a ton of them, and I'd say they're maybe even better.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there's so many examples of places like, Sedona. I believe we did a podcast with Kevin from the Verde Valley cycling group there, and they, it sounds like a lot of the trails there started out that way as social trails, as unofficial trails, and they were able to get those sanctioned, and then voila, like they've got this amazing asset and resource that really didn't cost anything to build. Like you said, people are out there building on on their own, and hopefully we'll see more of that is more acceptable to get trails authorized. I am seeing a bit like with the pandemic of hikers and different groups pushing back just as trails get more crowded everywhere. Even the neighborhood trails, as people are like working from home and maybe not traveling as much, but also for the like well-known destinations, those places are getting sort of overrun in the past couple of years as people, choose to do like RV or like car-based trips. And so we're hearing about places like Crested Butte that are filling up. Matt, how do you see that impacting trail use and trail building as we go forward from this time of like having some places really overcrowded?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think it will inform a lot of these newer trail destinations. I think that's kind of like the bottom line. I was talking about this with Aaron Rodgers last week, who runs Rock Solid Trail Contracting, like the biggest trail building company in the nation. They had some interesting notes, as far as like a lot of these destinations that exist now, there was no plan. Like they weren't necessarily meant to be destinations when trails started forming there. And so they weren't really built with a flow in mind. And I think you're going to see like those older destinations sort of informing the layout, the trail design, trail network design, and maybe even the city design in recreation destinations in the future so that it is more sustainable. Yeah, I mean, I passed through Moab and Sedona last, I guess it was October. By the time we got to Sedona, I mean, there were traffic signs in front of the trailhead saying this is closed to anyone except locals. So locals are the only ones who could get a parking spot at the trailhead. In Moab, yeah, I mean, there's no camping in sight unless you drove an hour outside of Moab and camped up on this bluff. So, yeah, I mean, these older destinations, as great as Moab and Crested Butte are, I mean, it's a different experience going to them now than it used to be even 5 years ago.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, something's got to change for sure. And hopefully as new destinations come online, that'll kind of take some of the stress off of the existing ones. But yeah, I mean, I also see the popular ones just continuing to gain in popularity as there's more mountain bikers out there. There's families integrating biking into their vacations. And, I mean, we can blame social media and all these other things of like, everybody wanting to go to the same places, the same iconic spots. But yeah, that's definitely a trend that I'm interested to follow and see how that plays out over the next few years, especially hopefully as things get back to semi-normal in terms of travel. So one of the unfortunate trends that I guess we're all hoping is sort of temporary through the pandemic has been supply chains for bike stuff. What do you guys see as far as the trends this year, Gerow? Do you think things are going to start improving on the supply side, or do we still have a little while to go?
I think we might have a little while to go based on what I've heard from folks, especially people who work at bike companies. Mm-hmm. And they're in a different situation where they're trying to buy 100 of a particular derailleur. And for sure that affects, the timing and their ability to get those things. Whereas going to the bike shop might be a little bit different, but also the huge component retailers that are also buying 100 of those derailleurs are largely out of everything. So a lot of the places I've been looking for components anyway, I'm not finding them. And there's stuff I've been looking for a long time. That situation hasn't changed. So I think it might continue for a little while longer. I mean, the factory that Shimano had to close a while ago, and all the people being sick and the new protocols, like in addition to all the shipping issues, it's just a big pile of new challenges. So
yeah,
I think it's around for a little while longer.
Yeah. It sounds like you're hearing from folks that it's still, they're thinking a couple of years maybe before like supplies get evened out and they can get the things they want when they need them.
Yeah, I mean, those things could certainly change, but I've heard from a couple of different brands that they've got fork and shock orders out a year or two before they're going to get anything. So
yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's not great news on their end.
Yeah. Yeah. Any thoughts, Matt?
No, unfortunately, not really. I mean, I think like when this stuff started to come to a head in 2020, the early pandemic, like we'd heard that it would be until, it could be 2 years up until 2023 until they'd get better. I'm optimistic things will get better this year, but I don't think that it will really return to normal until, probably 2023, maybe beyond that. So no optimism for me, I guess. Sorry.
Yeah.
Jeff, it's your turn. Be the sunshine.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a different take and, I don't know. I could be completely wrong on this, but I have a feeling that there will be a bit of like whiplash to all this. And I have no idea how long this will take, but I feel like we will see an oversupply of bike stuff. Maybe it's going to be in a year or 2 years or whatever, but I don't know, just thinking about the people I know that bought bikes early in the pandemic, people who hadn't been into the sport before, a lot of them got into it because they couldn't do anything else. And they bought what they could. They bought used. They bought, just whatever they could get. But then as things started opening back up, like I noticed those people were, they're starting to watch college football again and, do the things that they did before they found biking. I think some will stick around for sure. But yeah, I have a feeling that the demand is going to drop off pretty quickly. But yeah, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I guess that whiplash effect, like you mentioned, is kind of the other side of the coin to where you might have an oversupply soon.
Yeah, and the tough part too is that, people who were buying the bikes, there was a lot of stimulus money and people weren't going out to eat anymore. And so they're like, hey, I got money, I can buy a bike. And they did. Or they bought something else because they couldn't buy a bike. They said, oh, I'm going to buy that PS5 or PS7, whatever they're on now. Use that money for something else because I can't get a bike. And so that money's gone. And I just really hope that we're not like kind of kidding ourselves that people are still, people who couldn't buy a bike are like still wanting to buy one, that they haven't moved on.
Sure.
So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, in terms of existing trends or upcoming ones, is mountain bike geometry. And that seems like something that changes year to year. And it's like, oh, this year we're focusing on this angle or this measurement. And lately, one of those things that people seem to be really interested in is steeper seat tubes. What do you think, Gerow? Are seat tubes going to keep getting steeper, or are we kind of at the point where they're steep enough?
Well, I think it depends on the bike, like too many things. Mm-hmm. I'm forever in the gray area with every answer, it seems. But I think, on a hardtail where the seat tube gets steeper as it goes into its travel, something around 75, 76 degrees is pretty reasonable. And then with a full suspension bike where that seat tube stays a little more stable and fixed because the bike goes into its travel hopefully in a balanced way, especially while you're pedaling where this matters. Mm-hmm. A lot of bikes are closer to the like 76, 77 degree angle. And then there's like the Privateer with, I think it's 80 degrees on the 161. So yeah, I would say that human bodies are not changing. So at some point, like that angle can only go so far before it starts to cause problems for people's knees. And it isn't fixing the situation of like getting your weight further forward to compensate for the super long reach that you want on the descent, like that. Mm-hmm. That balance only goes so far before it kind of runs out of benefit. And I think having ridden the Privateer, that 80-degree seat tube took a while to get used to, and then it was amazing. And then every other bike I got on felt slack and weird, and like I couldn't keep weight on the front tire. So Like all these things will adapt, but I do think that might be close to the limit. I might eat those words 2 years from now, but I think I think seat tubes might chill out soon. And I honestly think geometry in general is getting closer to being where it fits really well with human bodies, both climbing and descending. And kind of like motorcycles, I think it might like chill out and not change a ton this year and in the next few years.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you there for sure, that it doesn't seem like there's a lot of areas where bikes need to be improved as far as geometry goes. And that, with a lot of these changes, it's like when we were trying to make head tubes much more slack, there were obvious problems with that. And so it's like, okay, we did that, but now we got a new problem. We need to address that. But yeah, I'm like you. I feel like we've gotten to a point where we've like adjusted things and compensated, and bikes are pretty good right now. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree as well. The privateer that Gerow had mentioned and actually sent this way had kind of spurred my thought. I mean, there's obviously still a lot of brands that sort of have to catch up to that. And maybe this generation, if there are brands that haven't crossed that 75-degree mark, then they will jump over it and, go from like 74 to like 78 or something like that. But noticing it on the privateer to where like if I pedal it around my block or something like that, and I'm on obviously flat ground, like I feel slammed into my hands. Going up Belcher or some other like heinous climb here in Colorado, I really appreciate it because it feels like I'm in a better seating position. But yeah, I mean, aside from 77, 8, 9, 80 degrees, I don't know how much more they can really change. But yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on, the head tube angle too, and the length of the bike changing as well. How much more are brands really going to push that? I don't know.
Yeah, you make a good point. I mean, that's unfortunately probably the likely scenario, is that brands will sort of continue to push the envelope on seat tubes just to outdo one another, only to realize that either it causes a new problem and, we have a solution to that, or they're going to back them back down. So yeah, maybe this is a opportunity to lock in today's reasonable seat tube angles, so you don't have to deal with it in a few years when they're a little out of control.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jeff. And I think there is a caveat too for cross country bikes, because what we're talking about and what we ride are bikes that are designed to pedal really well uphill, and then you're totally done with the saddle. That's it.
Right.
It has little bearing on the rest of the ride. Whereas cross country bikes, like you need to be in a position where you can get the most power into the pedals, right? So that's just a different position, and it's not necessarily an 80-degree seat tube angle. So those bikes are, I think, gonna stay a little bit where they are, or move around a bit more maybe, and they might experiment, but I don't know that they're going to necessarily move toward 80 degrees. And the same thing with downhill bikes. Like downhill bikes seat tube angle is about where the saddle is between your legs.
Yeah.
Because you're never going to sit on it. It's about pushing the bike around with your legs. So
yeah, that's really great point to consider those bikes that are more specialized at either end of the spectrum, right? Like cross country and downhill. And if you look at those, the geometry on those has not changed that much, because people aren't trying to do two very different things. On a downhill bike, a lot of them still don't even have droppers, right? Like the post is just slammed. Like you don't need to go up and down, like you're not going to be pedaling. So it's made for like one thing. It's optimized for that. But yeah, it's trying to find the right balance on these bikes that do go up and down. That's where we're seeing all the changes.
Yeah, for sure. I would say, like, on the more general geometry thing, the one thing that I would like to see is slightly longer head tubes. And maybe there's a weight issue there. Maybe there's like a story of the way that the down tube and top tube need to connect. I don't know. I'm not a frame engineer, but I don't know. I just feel like everybody who's riding these big bikes has like 15 to 20 millimeters of spacers under the stem that look awful. Like the bike would just look a lot better if there were more tube there. So I don't know. If anybody's listening, that's my 1.5 cents.
I'm on board for that for sure. Yeah. Just being tall. I feel like it always needs to be a little more. And I've always got a ton of spacers. So yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's talk about other trends we want to see over the next 5 to 10 years. Let's like look way out there and just go wild in our wildest dreams. Like what trends do we want to see? And Gerow sounds like longer, taller head tubes, maybe. What about you, Matt?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice for geometry to stabilize like we were talking about. I mean, I think that's geometry for the past 5 years has been the reason a lot of us have jumped to newer bikes, because we want to find out like, yeah, if the grass is really that much greener. And so far it has been. But hey, wouldn't it be nice to like feel a little bit less tempted to upgrade every 2 or 3 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, along those lines. Yeah, I mean, mountain biking is an expensive sport, and so yeah, I would like to see an even more welcoming sport of mountain biking, just one that's even more accessible to folks. I feel like we're heading in that direction for sure, getting people of all ages into the sport, people in different communities maybe that hadn't traditionally been exposed to it. Along those lines, Gerow, one of the things that you had mentioned in past conversations is athletes earning a more livable wage. And a lot of us, I guess, assume that athletes make a lot of money. I mean, they're celebrities, they're superstars, like they're living the life, but that's not always the case, is it?
Yeah, I mean, there's athletes like Rafaela Richter who just got a contract this year, finally. I mean, she's been sponsored before, but she just now kind of got to the point where she's going to be able to not work and not have to depend on, folks in her family to get her to races and get her through the season. And she's a multi-time German national champion in downhill and enduro. I mean, somebody who's that fast and that good can't make a paycheck, like that boggles my mind. And she's one example of many. I mean, there's a good chunk of the field in enduro and downhill. I think from my understanding, less so in cross country, but on the gravity side, a lot of folks are just not getting paid. And if they are, it's not what they're living off of. So I would really like to see that change.
Yeah. Yeah. For women, especially. I mean, most of these, gravity teams, they're pretty male heavy, and yeah, it seems like that's ripe for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know if that's like they need agents, they need somebody I don't know if that's the word, but if it would be helpful if there was somebody to advocate for them and someone whose job it was to make sure that athletes are getting connected, that they're getting paid fairly, that they're getting all of the benefits that they need. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's not the job of somebody who needs to be training 20 hours a week and stretching and lifting weights for another, I don't know, 15, 20. So yeah, it could be that there needs to be some more support in there in different ways.
Yeah, it does seem like the wages and just being able to make a living at our sport, I mean, that's important to a lot of people, and it could, a lot of up and coming athletes, that could be a deterrent for them to even want to like dedicate themselves to the sport. I know I thought it was funny. When I interviewed Nico Mullally, I was like doing some research on him online ahead of time and typed Nico Mullally into Google, and, it has those like suggested queries. And like the top one was Nico Mullally net worth. And it's like, I could just imagine these like middle school boys, Googling their favorite mountain bike athletes and being like, oh, can I make money at this? Like, could this be my career? And, I don't think there's even a decent result. I don't know that they'll ever know, but, that's definitely something that everybody needs to know is like, can I do this for a living? Like, I'm really passionate about it, but, I can't do it alone. So speaking of racing, one of the things that people talk about every now and then is the idea of more gravity mountain biking making an appearance in the Olympics. So downhill or enduro as an Olympic sport. What do you think about that, Matt? Would that be awesome or not necessary or what? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I feel like cross country is still, when it comes to that internationally recognized mountain bike discipline, it kind of takes up the most air in the room. Mm-hmm. I think it'd be cool to see downhill or enduro as an Olympic sport, but I also feel like the logistics of it would just be really, really tough to pull off in an Olympic setting. I mean, I think like the convenient thing about XC is like you start the race and within 2 hours it's done. To where it just seems like it would maybe take it a lot longer to move the entire field through a course.
Yeah, and also having the mountains for it could be tricky. Like it's not always held somewhere where there's like legitimate mountain biking, so you might have to have like the Olympics are in Florida, but we're going to have the downhill race somewhere else where there are downhills.
Right. Yeah, because you can build an XC course with, a few hundred feet of elevation throughout the whole thing.
Totally. Yeah.
If you got some random hills, you can build features and make tricky climbs out of not much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely been the challenge with some of these newer sports. I guess in 2020, they added surfing, and like that was a tough one. They had to have it on the other side of the country from where like the main Olympic venue was, and they had to rely on the waves. I mean, they had to make sure that there's going to be like good waves for it. So yeah, it seems like that kind of stuff can be overcome. And then you look at Beijing, like the Winter Olympics coming up, and I mean, they've built just like ski ramps in the middle of the city, and like no mountains required. So it's like, I feel like if somebody wants it to happen, it can happen in the Olympics. And just for me, I mean, I love XC. I think it's amazing. It's a fun sport to watch. And at the same time, especially if you look at how it entered the Olympics, I mean, it was basically like road riding. I mean, it was like the people who are good at road riding, if you're a strong athlete and you've got a strong motor, you can do well in XC. And, we have seen the courses get more difficult over time, so that the technical aspect is part of it. But I don't know, for me, mountain biking is all about that. Just like going fast, using gravity to your advantage, and like riding some pretty gnarly stuff. And I don't know, I feel like it'd be even more watchable, than XC, but.
Yeah, I think the filming challenges for enduro are also another thing to consider. Like if you're actually going to have 4 to 6 stages or whatever the number they happen to be, and they're all on different trails, like that's a whole lot of running wires. For example, for the World Cup downhill races, like all of those cameras you see are run on wires that go up and down the mountain. So it's not like somebody's just standing there with a camera they carried into the woods. Like it's a ton of work.
Yeah. Or it might not even matter. It would be like the XC Olympics this year, and the Olympics, like I had to wake up in the middle of the night to watch it on some like digital only platform. So yeah, it's like they don't even care anyway. Nobody's watching it. So I guess they could just say we're not covering it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to buy some Peacock offshoot and pay $5 to watch it.
Yeah. And it's just like a slideshow of like photographers throughout the course, like 2 days later, and see what happened. Yeah. Good point. Good points for sure. One final one, a trend I would love to see, and we're kind of seeing it in fits and starts from bike brands, but man, I can't wait for the day when we can like customize our bike builds. Like when you buy a new bike from Santa Cruz or whoever, I feel like you should be able to spec the bike exactly the way you want. You should be able to pick the saddle and the wheels and the tires and everything on the bike. But for whatever reason, we haven't seen that yet. What do you guys think about that, Gerow? Would you be into that, or are you okay with like choosing the things? Do bike brands do a good job? I guess I'm asking, speccing their bikes generally, or would you like to make changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would definitely make changes if I were to buy a complete bike, which I haven't done in years. I usually just buy a frame and build it up. But I think it totally makes sense, and it would be great if we were able to do that. From the product manager's side of that story, I totally understand why they don't want to do that, because that means they have to carry an entire warehouse of bike parts that may never sell, rather than just saying like, this is an NX bike with these RockShox parts, done. That's it. This is the bike you get. If you don't like it, you can change the components later or buy a different bike, but this is what we're selling you. The shock is in that way already tuned to that bike. Maybe in a few cases, the fork even has a different tune, especially with really big bikes. So yeah, just the ability to keep a reasonable number of parts on the shelf is, I think, a big part of why they don't do that. But it'd be rad if that was more possible. Maybe if they were able to get parts super easily and just order them as they need them, that could possibly work out.
Yeah. That seems like that would solve the issue. If they could order them, they don't have to have it ahead of time. And I'd be willing to wait. Be willing to say, if it's going to take them a couple weeks to like source all the parts or whatever brands, I'm okay with that. Or even just limited, like you pick this saddle or this saddle. You can pick like from these 2 or 3 sets of tires. Like that would, in my opinion, that would go a long way for sure. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are some smaller brands that do that well. So if you look at Gorilla Gravity, you have a lot more freedom as far as like how you can build out your bike. A lot of online bike shops like Worldwide Cyclery and Fanatic are doing that. And I think it's probably easier for them because they're carrying so many of those parts anyway. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to be as cheap as if you were to buy just a SRAM and RockShox build or a Fox and Shimano build from a specialized bike shop or something like that. I think it's always going to be more affordable that way just because those brands are going to buy in batches, and the more RockShox stuff they buy, the more they're going to save. Mm-hmm. So I think I'd like to see it, but just because I don't think like anybody, I think it's rare when somebody buys a bike and they're like, I love every single part on this bike. But I don't know if I see that changing much.
Yeah. And maybe we're not the best like focus group too, because we have tried a number of things and we probably have particular tastes at this point and know exactly what we want. Whereas for a lot of folks, it's like, I don't really know. Like, I just give me the thing that you think is the best. And so there is value in that spec that the brand manager has come up with and has said, we think this is a good spec. This stuff works well together and people are going to be happy with it. So yes, interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, you guys are the professionals, so just put the right parts on the bike and I'll buy it. Yeah, that's definitely a fair perspective.
Seems likely this will be a hybrid. We'll see both continue. Neither one is going to win out. Well, I think that about does it for these trends that we're seeing this year and perhaps in the future. If there are any trends that maybe you're seeing or things you'd like to see that we didn't mention, we'd love to hear about it. You can always email us, info@singletracks.com, or connect with us on social media. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.